Hello Year 11, welcome to your Medicine Through Time PPE prep. So just to be aware, as with previous papers, you have in front of you the exam specification. The highlighted sections are the sections that are going to come up in your PPE tomorrow, and therefore if you've not revised them yet, this is your opportunity to do so. The medicine paper is all about comparison. It's thinking about how much changed between different time periods and how much stayed the same. The time periods that are going to come up in your paper are going to be the medieval period, and you need to make sure that you know what the role of the physician was, the apothecary and the barber surgeon. You need to know what treatment they provided and what care they gave in the community and in hospitals. So if you think about it, those are kind of the doctors of their day. What did they do? What different things did they do in the medieval period? The second period that you study is what we call the Renaissance period, and that's from 1500 to 1700. Now, the bits that you need to know from that period of time are the case studies. So you need to know how the Great Plague in London was dealt with. So that means how were plague victims treated and how did people try to prevent the plague spreading. So thinking there about quarantine, the fact that government banned large gatherings and developing that further. The next period of time that you look at is 1700 to 1900. We call it the industrial period or the early modern period. Now you need to understand in that time period how ideas about the cause of disease and illness changed and they progressed, and that means they improved. And the big one here is Louis Pasteur's germ theory in 1861, followed by Koch's work on microbes. So if you remember, germ theory was discovered, which was that microbes caused disease and caused decay, not spontaneous generation theory, which suggested that decay caused microbes. So microbes cause decay, not the other way around. And what that meant was individual microbes that cause disease were discovered and could therefore be treated. So make sure you go back over germ theory and then subsequent work on microbes. You also need to understand how approaches to prevention and treatment changed in the industrial period. So we need to think specifically here about improvements in hospital care and how Florence Nightingale changed hospitals and developed them into the pavilion style with lots of fresh air, separate wards. Surgeons were able then to treat patients in hospital for the first time. You also need to think about the changes to surgery in this period of time. So we know that our problems of surgery are blood loss and pain. So what happened to deal with those? What happened to deal with blood loss, pain and infection? Specifically, pain and infection. So we need to think about the impact of anaesthetics, so chloroform, and James Simpson, and antiseptics, which was Lister and carbolic acid. Really focus on the difference between Lister and Simpson because they are easily confused. So Simpson was chloroform and anaesthetics, Lister was carbolic acid, which is antiseptics. Within that period of time, you also need to look at the case studies. So that means the diseases and illnesses that were particularly widespread in that period of time. So in this case, you need to look at cholera in London and how that was prevented in the end. So thinking about John Snow and the Broad Street pump, where he managed to track all of the cases to cholera around Broad Street pump in Soho, and he removed the handle from the pump, which proved that there was a link between water or dirty water and cholera, even though the government did not accept that link to start with. You also will need to look at Jenner and the development of the smallpox vaccine. So remember, we're talking about prevention there and how he prevented smallpox from, or smallpox outbreaks, I should say. Then you need to think about our last period of time, which is the modern period, which is 1900 all the way up to present day. And that's a period you should be really familiar with because you've lived through some of it. So if you see the modern period or to present day, Think about your experiences. So with that, you need to understand the advances in understanding the cause of illness and disease. So thinking there about the discovery of DNA and the fact that we know now that disease isn't just caused by viruses and bacteria, but it can be caused by our genes, by our genetics. Improvements in diagnosis. So think about, how we diagnose disease today. So things like blood tests, different types of scans. Some of you might well have had different scans, like a CT scan or an MRI scan or an ultrasound. So think about the way we diagnose things today. And then we need to think about approaches to prevention and treatment. So think about the impact of the NHS, the fact that we have a National Health Service that was created in 1948, which provides free healthcare to those in need. It provides hospital care and treatment and diagnosis. Yep. And also think about magic bullets and antibiotics. New medical and surgical treatments like keyhole surgery, robotic surgery. So those aspects that are highlighted are the aspects you need to go and make sure that you have revised. Now there are two areas that you can use. You can use your Pearson revision guide, and you've got the pages and activities on there. So remember, there's questions at the end of every page and a quick quiz, or you can use your Medicine Through Time revision guide. I would really advise you, if you've got your Medicine Through Time revision guide, to focus on the pages that compares the time periods. So at the end of every section, you have a table which breaks down change and continuity between the time periods. So have a real good look at those, as well as the page numbers that are on your screen. You have two sections on this paper, Year 11, Section A and Section B. Section A is about medicine on the Western Front. So that means the theatres of war, the types of terrain or land that soldiers fought on, and the types of injuries that arose from that. You'd consider new injuries that were developed, so things like shrapnel wounds or gas attacks, new medical treatments that were developed in response to those injuries. Section A will assess your knowledge in three ways. Number one, to describe two features of, and that's the same technique that you used on the Elizabeth paper. So that's going to be a feature followed by two sentences. You're then going to be asked how useful two sources are for an inquiry into. And then 2B, you're going to be asked to study one source and decide how you could follow it up to find out more about a particular topic. Section B is what we call the thematic study. So that's your medicine through time from 1250, which is the medieval period, all the way up to the present day. And there are three styles of question that you're going to come across. You've got an explain one way, in which you're going to have to be asked to compare two time periods. Explain why, which again is the same style as your Elizabeth paper, where you're aiming for three developed paragraphs. And a how far do you agree? And just like your Elizabeth paper, you will have a choice of two questions, so you will need to choose the one that you feel that you are most confident in. So your first style of question is to describe two key features. This is the same style of question as the Elizabeth paper, so you're required to identify a feature, a part of something, and then to develop it further with information. So the example that you have asks you to describe two features of a casualty clearing station. And if you remember, a casualty clearing station is part of the chain of evacuation which treated wounded soldiers, so removed them from the front line and then took them back to a place of safety. In this case, we have casualty clearing stations were set up in buildings such as factories and schools, and this has been developed further with additional information. These buildings were chosen because they were often located near to a railway line to allow the next stage of the chain of evacuation to take place quickly. And then the second feature is that a triage system was used to divide the wounded into groups in the casualty clearing stations. And then again, that's been supported with further knowledge. Those who were not likely to survive would only be made comfortable but not treated. Now you have a series of questions to try, and I would really urge you to sit down with your Medicine Through Time booklet or the Pearson online guide and to have a go at each one, because you could be asked a question on any aspect of medicine on the Western Front. So we have described 2 features of the trench system. So for that one, you'd be thinking about different parts of the trenches. So a frontline trench, a reserve trench. You could have a communications trench. Then we have described 2 features of the development of the storage of blood in the early 20th century. So we'd be thinking about blood banks, and we'd be thinking about agents that were added to blood to stop it clotting. Describe 2 features of the Thomas splint. So if you remember, the Thomas splint was used to treat fractures in the leg. So we'd be thinking about how many people were saved because of the Thomas splint, when was it first used, who developed it, and so on. So have a go at each of those questions using your revision guide. Now, the second question you will come across is a question that requires you to look at a source in detail and decide how useful it is for an inquiry into a particular topic. An inquiry just means a question or an investigation. This is going to require some preparation before you answer the question. So the first thing you need to do is identify what the inquiry is. What are you being asked to find out about? Once you've done that, you then need to look at the sources to consider whether or not they help you find out more about your inquiry. To be able to do this, you need to understand that sources are comprised of 2 parts. One part is the content and the other part is the provenance. Now the content is, if it's a picture source, what you can see, and if it's a written source, what the main body of the source is, the main part of the source, and what it tells you. The provenance is always given to you in an exam, and the provenance just means what the source is, when it was written or taken if it's a photograph, and who wrote it. And that information will always be given to you either just above the source or just below the source. And you can see on the screen in front of you those 2 parts of the source very clearly labelled. The content at the top in this case, and then the provenance underneath. You're going to need to be able to look at both to decide whether or not the source is useful for the inquiry that you're given. So, step 1 is to make sure that you underline the inquiry in the question. And if we look at the question on the screen in front of you, you can see that it's been underlined. So in this case, how useful are sources A and B for an inquiry into the effects of gas attacks? Once you've underlined that inquiry, you're then going to have a look at the provenance of the source first. So just remember, the provenance is who wrote it or who took the photograph, when that photograph was taken or when it was written. And it usually gives you a little bit of information about the person who wrote it or took that photograph. In this case, in the example in front of you, you will see that the provenance is highlighted in green. So you in your exam are going to highlight the key parts of the provenance. And in this case, we know that this source comes from a medical officer for the British. We know he described the effects of gas at the Battle of Ypres in 1915. So we need to think about why this person would be useful, would be helpful to us if we had an inquiry about the effects of gas attacks. And the key phrase I want you to think about is accuracy. Usually the person who has written the source is useful to us because they're going to be able to give us accurate information. So the medical officer would have seen the effects of gas attacks and would be able to give an accurate account of those effects. You may also know something about the year in which the source was produced. So in this case, we know it was 1915 and the Battle of Ypres. Well, you should know that in 1915, chlorine gas was first used. So that means it's going to be helpful to us in understanding the effects of chlorine gas. Once you've considered the provenance and you've highlighted the provenance, you then need to think about what the source actually suggests to us. What does it tell us about the inquiry that's useful? And the fact that you've been given the source by the exam board means it's always going to be useful, because you wouldn't be given a source if it wasn't. So we then need to think about highlighting words in the source that help us with the inquiry. What do those words suggest to us about the effects of gas attacks? So in your exam, you're going to highlight clues that the source gives you about the inquiry. And in this case, if we're looking at effects of gas attacks, the source says that I felt the action of gas on my respiratory system. So I would underline or highlight respiratory system. It burned in my throat. It caused pains in my chest and made breathing all but impossible. This person spat blood and suffered from dizziness. We all thought we were lost, which essentially means they thought they were going to die. So you then highlight those words and write down what that tells you about the effects of gas attacks. Once you've done that, you then need to write your response. And if you're not sure of how to structure it, I want you to remember JP COCO. Judgment, provenance, content and own knowledge, content and own knowledge. That is the structure that you will use. So in this case, you use the words of the question in the first sentence of your answer. You are always going to start your answer with, the source is useful for an inquiry into whatever the inquiry is, in this case, the effects of gas attacks. You are then going to respond with, it was written by, or it was taken by, and you will look at the provenance and you'll find out who it was written or taken by. And in this case, it was written by a medical officer, which means that he would have experience of treating those with gas attacks, which means that the information that he gives is likely to be accurate. We then develop that further by writing about the date if you can. Also, it was written in, and in this case, April 1915, which was when chlorine gas was first used, so it would give an accurate account of the impact of chlorine gas on soldiers, which makes it useful. You'll notice there that I haven't just written it was written in April 1915, which was when chlorine gas was first used. You have to go a little bit further than that and actually then state that it gives an accurate account of the impact of chlorine gas. That word accurate can be used. The source suggests that one of the effects of the gas was on the lungs. It said that gas caused pain in the chest. So we've got our quote in there as well, and made breathing all but impossible. So we have a second quote. And again, we need to add that to our own knowledge. This is useful because it is accurate information. And then you use your own knowledge. Chlorine gas was a killing agent that caused its victims to slowly suffocate and generated fear in the soldiers when it was first used because there was no effective treatment. A good historian will always look at more than one source to check its accuracy and to develop understanding. And that's what this question is asking you to do. It's asking you to think about how you could follow up a source to understand the topic further. So in this case, if it's a photograph, you would select one detail from the source that you would follow up. So in this case, the leg raised in the Thomas splint. You must make sure that you do not select detail from the provenance. The detail has to come from the content. So you could not select the detail, a Thomas splint in 1915, because that is from your provenance. It must be from the content of the source. You're then going to ask a question about that source. I would try and ask a numerical question. So how many patients were treated using the Thomas splint, or how many patients were treated at a casualty clearing station, whatever that source is about, but try and make that question numerical. Then it comes to the type of source you could use. I want you to remember two types of sources. You could use Army medical records because Army medical records have statistical data on the number of soldiers who suffered with different injuries. Or you could remember medical journals because that has details by doctors and nurses of medical treatments that were used. And then the how might this help me answer my question? Well, it's going to help you answer your question because it will tell you how many soldiers were treated, or it might tell you the types of treatments that were used, or it might tell you different treatments that were used, new treatments that were used. So here's another example of a how can I follow up a source question. So you have a photograph of a casualty clearing station in 1915 on the Western Front. You need to select a detail that you would follow up. You cannot write detail I would follow up is 1915 on the Western Front, because that's from the provenance. You need to find it from the source itself. So in this case, one of the details could be the man having his pulse taken whilst laying down in bed. So that could be your detail. The question you would ask is, well, how many men were treated in casualty clearing stations? What type of source could you use? Well, hospital or RAMC records, so Royal Army Medical Corps records. And how might this answer my question? Because those records give the date of admittance, records of injuries and care given. So just a reminder, really, Year 11, for this type of question, the only knowledge that you need to have is the knowledge of other sources that could be used. So remember to learn what RAMC and hospital records show you, and also what medical articles show you. And if you can remember those two types of sources, you know that you are always going to be able to answer this particular question. We then move on to section B, which is your thematic study. So that's medicine from 1250 up to the present day. The first question you'll come across in section B asks you to compare two different time periods. And it will either ask you how those two different time periods were similar or how they were different. The question here focuses on difference. So in this case, you needed to explain one way in which the ideas about the treatment of disease were different in the 17th century from ideas in the 13th century. Now, to be successful in this question, you need to understand two things. First of all, whether or not you're being asked to compare a similarity, so things that stayed the same, or a difference. So make sure that bit of the question is underlined. The other thing that you need to understand is the time periods and what that means. So in this case, if we're talking about the 17th century, we count back, so we're talking about the 1600s, and that is in the Renaissance period. You're being asked to compare that to the 13th century, so we count one back, that means the 1200s, and if we're in the 1200s, we are in the medieval period. So to answer that question, you write down what happened in the earliest century. So in this case, the 13th century, because it came before the 17th century. And then you develop that with information. And then you just use the phrase, however, this was different to, and then you discuss the latest century. So just to remind you, you start writing about the earliest century first and develop your response. And you compare it, if you're looking for a difference, to the later century with the phrase, however, this was different to the whatever century that is, because. So you have some examples on your page to try. So one is explain one way in which surgical treatment was different in the 18th century to the present day. So again, we're talking about difference. And in this case, the 18th century, which means the 1700s, which means the industrial period of time, to the present day. So that means today. So think about your medical experiences today, and I have no doubt they'll be relevant. Explain one way in which ideas about the causes of illness and disease were different in the 13th and 19th century. So we've got difference again. We've got the 13th century, so we count back one, it's the 1200s. And the 19th century, we count back one, it's the 1800s. So that means we're being asked to compare the 1200s, which are in the medieval period, to the 1800s, which are in the industrial period. Explain one way in which the role of the physician, which means doctor, was different in the 13th century to the present day. So that means the 13th century, count back one, it's the 1200s. To the present day, that means today. So I would imagine you will all have had an experience about doctors today. So you would have an understanding of what they did. So things like diagnosis, prescribing treatments. How was that different to physicians in the 13th century, the 1200s? You will then be asked to explain why. Now that is the same style of question as your Elizabeth paper, so we'd be looking for 3 developed paragraphs with a point, evidence, explanation. So you've got some examples to try. Explain why surgery changed so rapidly, that means quickly, in the 19th century. And again, you'd underline those key words. So what are we talking about here? Well, we're talking about surgery, and we're talking about the 19th century. So we're going to go back, that means the 1800s. Then we've got number 2, explain why there were changes in ideas about the causes of disease, 1850 to present day. Now remember, present day means today, and in this case we're talking about causes. So what causes people to become ill? So you need to be really careful that you don't confuse your causes and your treatments and prevention. Causes means what causes people to be ill. Prevention means what's introduced to stop people becoming ill in the first place, and treatment is how do we treat, how do we make people better. Number 3, explain why there were changes to hospital treatment 1800 to present day. Well, again, in that case, we're talking about treatment, so how people were made better, and we're talking about 1800 to today, present day. Explain why there was progress in medicine 1750 to 1900. So that means explain why things improved. If we're talking about progress, it means things have changed, and they've changed for the better. So it's asking you why there have been changes in medicine from 1750 to 1900, and so therefore why have things got better? So you could be thinking there about surgery and the fact that there was anaesthetic developed and antiseptics. You could be thinking about germ theory that was developed in 1861 and the work on microbes. And then number 5, explain why there was progress in medicine 1900 to present day. So think about what's happened more recently, which means that there has been improvements in medical care. So you could, for example, write about the creation of the NHS in 1948 and the fact that more people have access to medical care. You could be thinking about the development of antibiotics, the magic bullets, the discovery of DNA, so greater understanding in the cause of disease as well. So lots of potential points. So use your medicine booklet or your Pearson online guide to have a go at planning the answers to those questions. And then the last question that you will come across is the same as your Elizabeth style. It's a how far do you agree? So you will be given a period of time and a statement and asked whether or not you agree with that statement. So let's have a look at 3 examples that you could plan the answers to. The work of James Simpson was the most important development in surgery 1800 to present day. How far do you agree? So if we're underlining those key words, James Simpson would be the first one. James Simpson, if you remember, discovered chloroform when he was found under a desk with his friends because he'd finally found a vapour that acted as an anaesthetic. And we're talking about development in surgery. So what else changed in surgery in the 1800 to present day? So we could be considering there the development of robotic surgery, keyhole surgery, because if we're thinking about present day, that means what is available today. Number 2, the discovery of DNA was the most significant development in medicine 1850 to present day. How far do you agree? Well, you've covered DNA in science, so think about the impact of the discovery of DNA. It's incredibly important because we know that there are hereditary causes of illness and disease, not just viral or bacterial. So we would say that that's incredibly important because it's led to our understanding of the cause of disease. But there are other factors from 1815 to present day, such as germ theory, work on microbes, lifestyle factors, greater understanding that different lifestyles can cause diseases. You might want to look at science and technology, the development, for example, of different methods of diagnosis like CT scans, X-rays. You could use your Western Front knowledge there as well from World War I, so things like storage of blood for blood transfusions. You might want to talk about the Thomas splint there. And then number 3, the creation of the NHS was the biggest development in medicine 1900 to present day. How far do you agree? You could use DNA or penicillin there. So again, NHS is really important. In 1948 it was established because it presented free healthcare. But you might look at things like DNA, which developed our understanding of the cause of disease, the development of antibiotics in the 1940s, which allowed bacterial infections to be treated and affected a wide range of people. Just remember that when you read that statement, you are then going to, first of all, underline the key words. You're then going to draw a table with information to support or agree on the left, information to challenge on the right. You're going to put the information from your bullet points into that table, as well as your own knowledge. You're then going to have 3 sections to your answer. One section that agrees with the statement, one section that provides alternative evidence, and a conclusion. If in doubt, agree with the statement. So start with "it can be agreed that," and then you bring in your evidence to support it, and then "on the other hand," and then "in conclusion." If you decide that you disagree with the statement, you're going to start with "it can be disagreed that," and you then put your evidence, "on the other hand," and then "in conclusion." So 3 sections.